¿Qué ondas, primos?
Primas.
Y primes.
Welcome to
My Primos.
My Primos.
My
Primo
podcast.
My name is Freddie.
My name's Kevin Garcia.
My name is Elia Maria Madrid.
Well, this is Chikume, whenever I can make it.
My Primos podcast discusses all things fandom and pop culture,
From comic books,
Movies?
To whatever obsession we have this week.
but with a Latine
Latina.
my Latino.
perspective. Remember, we're all primos,
We're all primes.
We're all primos.
no matter what part of the world we're from. ¿Qué ondas, primos y primas and primes, and welcome back to My Primos podcast. My name is Primo Freddie, and with me tonight is my primo and yours, Mr. Kevin Garcia _.com. Say
Close
what's
enough.
up, Kevin?
What's up, Kevin? Which is, why do you add extra dots and underscores? It's just,
Because it's .com, man.
look, it's either kevingarcia.com or kevingarcia_com, but not kevingarcia_com.com.
You know what it is? I'm holding it over your head because you told us a lie, shenanigans, saying that he owns kevingarcia.com.
I do. I just don't have the freaking, I don't know what I'm supposed to get some kind of like a DNS. I don't know what the heck it's called. I have to get something through GoDaddy and they want me to pay like a bunch of extra money just so everybody can get it without it tripping their like malware detector. There's no malware on my website. It forwards to my free WordPress. Like I'm very cheap.
You're a virus, Kevin Garcia.
I'm a high school
You're a
teacher. I am
virus.
very cheap. In
You're
Texas.
a virus. Well, speaking of, we are back, primos. We had a little bit of a break. Elia's out today, and Chikume, I think, is traveling somewhere in the tundras again. He's always out doing his thing. But tonight, of course, me and Kevin are with you. We have a special guest. Mr. Kevin Garcia, I want you to go ahead and introduce our special guest for the evening.
We have Professor Gabriel Cruz, who I know through TikTok as Dr. C. He has these amazing TikToks where he's constantly comparing things like movies and TV, but especially comic books, while looking at them through a Latino lens, much like we do in a much less academic way here on the podcast.
Yeah.
But you can also find him on his own podcast, Office Hours with Dr. C. Dr. C, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I think I'd happy to do so. So I'm Dr. C. And it just occurred to me, on social media, no one ever calls me Primo, but I get Tio from time to time, and I think it's because I look really friggin' old. But yeah, so I study superheroes in particular. I study superhero narratives, broadly speaking, whether that's on the comic book page or on TV or film, and how they operate as ways of transferring ideologies, right, to audiences and that kind of thing, particularly when it comes to race, class, and gender. So, yeah, I'm happy to be here and talk to you all about it.
I'm getting
I mentioned
flashbacks right
Kevin.
now. Hold on.
Whoa, Kevin. I'm stopping you. I'm
All right,
stopping
all
you
right.
here, homie.
You go.
I have a question because my son stopped me one day. We went to Austin. We visited with Professor Latinx, Federico Aldama, UT. Yep. I don't know if you're familiar, but he's a fan in front of the show. I'm gonna say it out loud, Fred. But when we went to talk, my son was like, hold on. So he teaches a class about superhero movies? Like, well, there's more involved, but I didn't have an answer for him. So for people that don't know, you legitimately cover the narratives from comic books or just superheroes in general. Like, can you explain it a little more for the 14-year-olds and like my son? Like, you could be a professor of?
Yeah.
You know?
Hold up. If I didn't already know Freddie had a teenage son, I would be thinking this is one of those long roundabout ways to, my friend has a question. Not me. My friend has a question.
No, I own it. I'll own it. Trust me. I know it. I want to major in Saved by the Bell. But you know what? Hasn't happened yet.
Listen, I was at a conference a couple years ago where someone gave a presentation on soap operas. And that was their primary area of research. Like, that's a thing, man. Right. So, yeah, actually, a couple things real quick. One, you mentioned Professor Latinx. I am a big fan of Frederick Luis Alama's. And that's good because you can't get anywhere near comic book studies without getting into his work.
Exactly.
And actually, a good friend of mine, Anthony Ramirez, Dr. Anthony Ramirez now, was a student of his. And it's funny. This is the second time I've encountering Aldama by proxy. But yeah, so when it comes to superhero narratives, basically if I do the elevator pitch, superheroes are characters that are modern visions of the future that are burdened with the sins of our past in some pretty meaningful ways. So like they deal with time both in the past, the present, and the future. And so that's why I like studying them, is because they are larger than life symbols for dealing with not just anxieties, but also aspirations about how society operates. Maybe the best example, or one of the best examples, is the X-Men, because a lot of people think of them as like a commentary on like civil rights issues and discrimination and things like that. And that's a bit of that, kind of, yes, depending on what time you're looking at them, certainly post 80s, right, with Chris Claremont run.
Very above the water, right? Like very basic.
Yeah. I mean,
definition.
we can't give them too much credit, but also they were trying to say something, certainly, right? And Claremont knew what he was about.
Yeah, Claremont definitely went in with intention. Stanley, it's arguable, but Claremont went in with intention.
Absolutely.
Now, the success of that's up to the interpretation.
Like I said, he knew what he was about, whether or not he was particularly effective at it. But actually, if you look earlier, one way to look at the X-Men is as a commentary on the anxieties around the atomic bomb.
Also,
right?
Especially the early 60s issues, mid 60s issues, rather.
This was the first, I think, one of the first collected editions of the X-Men was called Children of the Atom.
Yep.
Right.
One of the
Atom. Yeah.
Yeah. And there is, if I remember right, and Kevin, you may know better than I, but like there is a sort of hand-waved explanation of like, well, it's because of nuclear proliferation.
No, it's not. They flat out state it. Like the Beast, they talk about his dad working in a nuclear power plant.
Right.
Professor X, his dad was a nuclear physicist. So there was all the idea that because their parents had worked around radiation, that's why mutants exist.
So in
the 60s.
And in that vein, there's a couple different ways. Back up for a second. There's a variety of ways you can look at it. Look at comic books and superhero narratives. There are two in particular that I find particularly fascinating. One is that what I do, and that is looking at how these characters operate as symbols, how these stories operate as moral logic, right? Because every superhero story has a logic to it. That is to say, it's inviting us to see the world in a particular kind of way. Right. The other way to looking at it is actually a friend of mine, Dr. Julian Chambliss, up at Michigan State University, which, by the way, Michigan State University has the largest publicly available comic book library in the world.
I borrowed from them before through interlibrary loan.
And my buddy, Dr. Chambliss, he is the director, I think, of that museum, but he looks at them as cultural artifacts in their moment. So what can we learn about them? And actually, last time I talked to him, he was working on a project that looked at like how do the naming and labeling practices for the genres what does that tell us about the moment in which they were created? So there's all kinds of ways you can look at superheroes and comic books and that kind of thing. I like the one that requires less history work, if I'm being honest.
I mean, it's up for interpretation, right? With anything we do, and I think that it's really like a great feeling that we can discuss. We talked about in the show a lot about how comic books are political. Comic books are a commentary on everything.
And always have been. In fact, I was just on a podcast from another TikTok mutual, Hightailing Through History, and literally the whole thing we did 2 hours worth of podcast. That's just the history of all of comic books being political. Actually, although we recorded 4 hours, I talked way too much. But hearing you talk about academia, Gabriel, I'm having these flashbacks because my master's thesis was supposed to be about superheroes as a modern oral tradition mythology, literally having them be modern gods. Long story I don't want to get into. It didn't work out that way. I still got the thesis. I still got my master's. I have the master's, but I couldn't do the thesis the way I wanted to. That part didn't happen. But it involved kind of going through and seeing, like we talked about Stan Lee and Chris Claremont. Mine was about how the things that we attach to these heroes are the things that we as a society have decided are the parts that count. But that doesn't mean like one person went in and said, I'm writing a story where the X-Men are going to be, you've never heard of them before, but they're going to be this great allegory. It's just that part developed over time, almost like oral tradition, where people pick up on the parts they like, and that's the part they remember. So sidetrack, I just, flashbacks to that whole situation.
So in that vein, when we look at superheroes and superhero narratives, there is a tendency for people to want to say that like, Wolverine is this, right?
Yeah.
Or Gambit is that. And the truth is, at some point, you have so many different versions of these characters, right?
Exactly.
And it's not a matter of intention, like you say. It's a thing that develops over time. So really, every person has their own iteration of these characters.
Exactly.
And when it comes to like superhero narratives and that kind of stuff, and actually my dissertation. So for my dissertation, I looked at Steve Rogers, Mystique, Jean Grey, Miles Morales, and Luke Cage,
Good
and how
combination.
from the perspectives of race, class, and gender, right? And I took selections from each decade that they had a publication, that came out, that kind of thing. And I had to do that because it had to just be pieces, because there's no way I'm going to read all the comics from Captain America from the 1940s, right? He only took a break for about a decade and a half. And that's,
hey, my thesis was supposed to be the entire history of Superman. So
good day.
Think about that for a
Such
second.
a Kevin Garcia thing.
That's kind of bonkers. Yeah.
Oh no, I got through a lot of it.
So wow. So the argument that I made was that, like, as part of the reasoning for why I'm picking just a handful of editions, basically, was that we consume these things in fragmented pieces, right? You read a couple issues here and there. It's easy to take for granted that now we have things like Marvel Unlimited or DC Universe, right?
Yep.
Where you can have all that stuff collected in one place. But, you used to have to sort through long boxes, right? To find the comics that you wanted. And we would consume this media in a very piecemeal kind of way, right? So that's why I went after collected editions, because I can make the argument, well, at least we know that these comics could reasonably be read all together, right?
Yep.
So we assemble out of the fragments our own versions of these heroes, which is why I can never love Scott Summers. Ever.
Because you've read too much.
Hey,
because I've read too much. Because when I studied Jean Grey, I read too much of her stuff, and I was like, this guy is a bag of dirt, and I can't do it.
Little aside, not relevant to this conversation, but I really wish they'd let him go full villain, because Magneto has fully transitioned to a hero. Let Scott Summers be a villain, because I think he's way more interesting as a villain than he is as a hero.
Yeah, I'd be more into it if he was a villain.
The only time I pulled for Dr. Doom was when in Battle World. Right. Yep. When Cyclops has the Phoenix Force and God Emperor Doom just crushes his head, and I thought that man's doing the Lord's work. Right.
There you go.
Anyway, but
it's like, look, he's a dictator, but he got rid of Scott Summers.
Hey, it made somebody happy.
Listen, 1 for 10 ain't bad. Right. Like anyway. Yeah.
No, man, it's a trip, but when you talk about the narratives, I think I saw one of your videos that I really, really connected with the death of the author. When you mentioned how separating the work, separating the work from the, I mean, at this point, everybody has their version of, right? Like, just look at Spider-Man, right? Or Superman. Everyone has their version of Spider-Man or Superman that they grew up with, or they like, or they, you know what? That one has some edge on them. Like me personally, I loved when Superman lost his powers and he was the electric Superman. Like, he was that blue streak Superman. I love that Superman. And also American Alien. Like, I love that run. Like, that Superman was so down to earth.
Is American Alien the one where he went for the walk?
Yes. And he gets drunk.
That's one where
they were like, Superman can't get drunk.
Did a little bit more with it. I wish there was a little bit more with that story, but I get where you're going from.
But I like American Alien.
And that's the point. The fact that you can like the blue Superman that was much maligned is the idea that anybody can like any part of it. And one thing that really got me when Blue Superman was happening was everybody's like, oh no, this is Superman forever. And I'm like, have you never read a comic book before?
Well, it's and that's part of the beauty is that another reason that it's so great looking at these stories is because they're not bound to continuity. Like, really, I mean, they deal with the basic, stuff of common histories that we understand, like Steve Rogers comes out of the ice, Superman lands in Kansas, that kind of thing.
That's the oral tradition part I was talking about.
Right. And so because they can change though over time, right? We can get Elseworld stuff like Red Sun, right?
Yeah.
Although I would like to see a more modern version where like Clark Kent lands in Brownsville, Texas.
Tell me about it.
Right?
That'd be amazing.
My hometown.
Oh, is it really? Okay.
Oh, yeah. I figured you said it because you knew that.
No,
like
I
you
was
did it on purpose. Pluto 956.
When's he going to, get picked up by some rancheros? Was like we got Brownsville and maybe El Paso, I suppose.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
but El Paso's more city. So
right. Or a bit more like Red Sun and have him land in like Juarez. But the idea of like you can have these more modern iterations of these characters, and that's a fascinating artifact in and of itself, right? And Marvel's done that obviously with all their different universes, which do they still have different Marvel universes at this point? Did they
Yes.
consolidate them all
Yeah.
again?
No,
Okay.
they
Yeah.
do.
I
They do. In
remember
fact, they just relaunched the Ultimate Universe. But hold on, I want to tie to what you said for a quick second, because as you're saying that, it occurs to me there is a comic right now that we've talked about on this show that is basically What If Superman, but in the Texas border,
Mhm.
and that's El Pesojero.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
basically
The Peso Hero, Mr.
the
Hector.
early days of Superman, like where he couldn't fly, but he was still, going after social causes.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that does exist, but it exists in the indie sphere, which is kind of the thing.
Yeah. But yeah, so when I was looking at those characters for my dissertation, and the reason I picked them is because they all occupy such niche parts of society.
Mhm.
There is so much more to them than just like there's more to them than just beating up the bad guy, right?
Yeah.
For example, like Luke Cage, right? When you take a character like Luke Cage, who debuts in like, what was it, 1972, something around that, early 70s.
Yeah.
And Steve Englehart, one of the first writers, Steve Englehart, right? He takes over after Archie Goodwin leaves, says in no uncertain terms in the prologue to the Marvel Masterworks collected volume of Luke Cage, Marvel wanted that civil rights money. So they sent 3 white guys to create a black superhero, right? And then in the first pages of Luke Cage Hero for Hire #1, an inmate comes up to Cage and says, "Hey, we're going to do a demonstration to protest like the way we've been treated, right? Are you down?" And Cage is like, "No, I'm not. I'm not getting beat for someone else's cause, right? I'm in here to do my time and then get out, right?" And that's a very different way of representing the character than what we get in like Netflix, right, or the Disney Plus series now.
Well, I want to jump to in between for a quick second. There's a great article by a friend of mine, Evan Narcisse, who writes some Black Panther stuff now at Marvel. But he did an article on, I don't know if it was on Gizmodo or The Root, but one of those Gawker sites. And it was basically remembering as a kid reading. This is when Luke Cage and Iron Fist were together as teammates, right? Reading as a kid and realizing, wait a minute, this is written by a black guy, because that was when he went by Owsley then, Jim Owsley, but Christopher Priest. My brain shut off for a quick second.
Yeah.
That was when Christopher Priest was writing that briefly, and reading it, he was reading some of the dialogue and especially the internal monologue of Luke Cage, and it made a big difference to him as a young man, where he could say, "Hey, I honestly feel like this black man is being written by a black man, and I can feel that." And that made all the difference in the world for him. And that kind of led to the Luke Cage we get in the series, where it's clearly there are other voices in the room.
Yeah. As opposed to like when Brian Azzarello wrote Luke Cage and he felt like a Fox News trope.
Oh God. Are we talking? Oh yeah.
That like 6-issue run.
The Mac. Oh God. I blocked that out.
You should. It's my dissertation. I can't get it out my brain now.
That reminds me. In the Ultimate Universe, they had another Hulk who was a black a scientist who was a black man who worked with Bruce Banner on the project.
I'm uncomfortable with this already.
Yeah, I know. It's gonna get worse when you find out who wrote it. Mark Millar. So he's a scientist, and he developed a way to become a Hulk without any of the downsides that Bruce has. And what does he do with all this power? He redesigns himself as a drug lord with gold teeth and tattoos, and puts on a new affectation that he didn't have when he worked in the office.
Oh no!
Just so he can take on a new personality. And I think he calls himself Tyrone or something now, which was not his original name. And I'm like, I would love to see that character introduced into the regular Marvel universe, but by some black creators.
Right. The way
but Kevin, remember you.
Yeah.
But you remember DC when the Green Lantern.
Oh God!
When they first introduced him, remember, we had a whole conversation about this.
Yeah, buddy.
Wait, let me just give some context here for a second. But before we get to what he's talking about, I want to give some context on me for a second. As a little kid, my favorite superhero was probably Green Lantern. Even though 90% of what I read was was Marvel. The one DC book I read was Green Lantern, and I ate it up, all of it. I loved it. And then they killed off all the Green Lanterns with Emerald Twilight, and they were going to have a new Green Lantern. And I'll be honest with you, I wasn't that big of a fan of Hal Jordan. In fact, John Stewart was my favorite. I had the Mosaic series.
John Stewart is the best one.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the thing I loved about the Green Lanterns was the concept of the best of every species getting together and saving the universe. I loved that idea of that unity that they had. And they replaced all of those with one guy. And I was like, all right, I'll give it a shot. And literally I opened the book and it's just a bland white guy. And I was like, I was like 15, I think. And I was like, nope, I'm done. That was it. I stopped reading Green Lantern. And years later, people told me, "Oh no, he's Mexican." I go, "What?" So I went to go read this.
Yeah.
He learned as an adult that he was secretly Mexican because his dad is a Mexican assassin.
I mean,
And I was like,
right?
"What the? This is the stupidest." I'm like, "Look,
It's Sicario, man. It sells books.
I know my mother is blonde of Scottish descent. I know, I don't speak good Spanish. I understand all of that stuff, but at the same time, what was that? It's like DC's like, we want representation. And then I found out later that Hot Girl, they're like, oh, well, Hot Girl's also Latina. I go, really?
Yeah, that she's
And
Latina.
but I read that, and maybe you've read more Hot Girl than I have because I've only read the description. The description says a Latina girl committed suicide and her white grandmother's soul took over her body and became Hot Girl. And I'm like, wait, what?
Oh no.
I'm like,
Oh,
what?
A lot of depth there.
I'm like,
What does that represent?
oh,
You know
my
what I
Lord.
mean? Like, there's a
Yeah.
lot there.
But on that note, that's why we wanted to bring you on here because
Yeah.
we wanted to talk about this idea of Latina representation in superhero media, especially as it comes to Marvel and DC. And
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to hear from you. What are your thoughts on that whole
It's not
can of worms?
great. It's not great. It's no.
Not
So
good.
honestly, when you were talking about the Green Lantern thing, I thought, is this when they introduced Hal Jordan? Not Hal Jordan, Kyle Rayner. And
Yeah.
yep, and
Yep.
yeah.
Oh, by the way, real quick aside,
Yeah.
you go back and read the first appearance of Jon Stewart. It's great because literally Hal Jordan is looking at him and talking to one of the Guardians. Says that guy, he can't be the Green Lantern. He's horrible.
Yeah.
And the Guardian, who by the way is telepathic and omniscient, says we don't need your bigotry here.
Yep.
He
Mhm.
flat out says
Mhm.
Hal is racist, and he
Mhm.
knows it on a deep level.
Which
Oh, yeah.
really makes sense for the whole genocidal arc later on.
Oh
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, not that, and his best friend that he called by a racial slur for most of his appearances.
Oh, all right.
Oh
I
yeah,
missed
you
that
got
bit.
to go back to the '60s for that. Hal's best friend was of indigenous Alaskan descent, and I'm not even getting into what he was called for 20 years.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Ooh.
so
But
yeah.
man, that was your boy, man.
So-
The Green Lantern.
No, that's the thing. The idea of the Green Lantern, not Hal. Never Hal.
Hal.
Not hashtag not my Green Lantern.
never Hal. Yeah.
He's worse
Never
than
Hal.
Cyclops.
Yeah.
Uh,
What? No, well,
yeah, I'll give it to him.
he's in the same conversation along with old what's his name? He's going to be in the new DC movies played by Nathan Fillion.
Oh, Guy Gardner?
Guy
No.
Gardner.
No, Guy
who's-
Gardner's
Guy
different. And I'm not going to defend Guy Gardner as a character, but I will say Guy Gardner and John Walker, U.S. agent,
Mhm.
what's interesting about both of them is that they are bad people that are trying to become good people. Like they're literally, both of them individually will be the kind of guy that will say to either Sam Wilson or John Stewart, I have a black friend, and the other guy's going to be like, oh God, man, just shut up. But they're trying. Whereas Hal Jordan,
Mhm.
he doesn't try. He's just a horrible person.
So I'm gonna tie this into something that connects to this, and then I'll get into the aspect of Mexican
Yeah,
of
yeah,
Latino
go for it,
representation,
go
right?
for
So like, because this is actually a really good point. The way that I consider analysis of superheroes is a modern day ahistorical consumption of them, right? Because I'm
Yeah.
assuming that the reader is reading in this moment.
Yes.
Right. So you take someone like Guy Gardner, right,
Yeah.
who has a bowl
Okay.
cut, right,
Yeah.
and that's important. That's an important piece of data.
He didn't originally have the bowl cut.
Because what he does in the death of Superman.
Yeah, he did for
right?
most of his
Yeah.
career, but originally
So-
he just had red full hair.
Who
Anyway,
else?
Yeah.
Who else quite infamously has a bowl cut? Like real life villain.
Are we going with Korea here?
No, we're going with United States. In the last, it's probably only been about 10, 15 years. Dylan Roof.
I can't place it.
Oh yeah, I've heard that. You know what? You're not even the first person to tell me that.
And more
Oh.
to it, there is a group of online Nazis that call themselves the Bowl Patrol.
Jeez.
Ah.
And this is an example of like intertextuality because you have that horrifying Charleston massacre that happened a few years ago,
Yeah,
right? You
yeah.
have that spin-off group
Yeah.
of these idiots online who style themselves that way. And now comes a question of whether or not they're going to have Guy Gardner with the bowl cut and the implied politics that go along with that in this moment in time. And that seems
What
kind of
about the
silly.
Punisher symbol?
I guarantee
That
well,
became
wait.
that became a symbol of hate.
Before we get to the Punisher symbol, I guarantee you they won't put the bowl cut in there any more than they would give J. Jonah Jameson the little Charlie Chaplin mustache. Because It just doesn't work today. Like it barely worked in the early 90s, but it definitely doesn't work today.
So that I use that example to bring to the point of like when you consume media now, you are consuming it in your moment, right, of your context and that kind of thing, and how that informs it. So going back to the thing about Latino representation, actually my favorite example for representations of Latinos in comic books is not the first Latino, right, who was Hector Ayala, right?
Well, definitely. No? Let's get to that. I'll give you the history.
We'll show you.
Who's the guy you're talking about?
Extraño.
Oh yeah, the one from DC Comics.
We covered Extraño from DC.
He's also not the first from DC either.
No. Yeah.
Oh my lord. Let me just really quickly tell you who the first was from DC. It's great. So there's this guy called the Whip, and he's basically just Zorro, just flat out Zorro with the serial number race.
I forgot about it. Yeah.
But here's the funny part. His origin is that he's a white American that went down to Latin America and decided to become a hero by taking on a fake Mexican accent while fighting crime, so that when he puts on the mask, he goes, "This is the Weep," and then he takes it off and he's like, "Well, honey, that guy really saved the day, didn't he?" You know, and that was that was DC's attempt at like, let's cover Latin America.
At least El Kabong, right, and when I had some charm to it, right?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
But as we continue, we want to get to Extraño. Freddie, I want to share some pages that Freddie and I had collected before of some superheroes from Marvel and DC to kind of go through some of them and kind of look at a little bit about what they mean. And we have Extraño in here, so that's why I wanted to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, he's part of the deck.
Yeah, part of the deck. So first on our list, we have Araña, who occasionally goes by Spider-Girl. This was the idea of having a Latina Latina Spider-Girl, obviously. And one of the things they did was they wanted to go all in on that Latina aspect by even having her name with an Enya, but her civilian name is Anya, spelled with a Y, which I think is an interesting choice. And I just wanted to really quick get your perspective. They're trying to increase representation, and they do that by saying that she is Spider-Man, but we're not going to call her Spider-Girl. We're just going to call her by a Spanish name instead.
So there's because I remember that there's some sort of discourse in the comic about whether or not she goes by Spider-Girl, right?
Yeah. Because
there's some other characters as well. Actually, I want to take this opportunity to reference a great book called Graphic Borders.
Okay.
Latino Comic Books, Past, Present, and Future, which was edited by Aldama and Christopher Gonzalez. And it has a chapter that I use often related to Spider-Girl. And in particular, it has to do with the way in which she's depicted. And like she's 14.
Yeah. Well, she was when she started.
Which she was when she started, right? And that's the first thing that comes to mind, honestly, because the way in which they depict her is not just consistent with superhero depictions of women, right? With adult figures, even when they're minors, but also is consistent with the way in which women of color are often depicted.
I'm gonna put a little asterisk on that, because when she first appeared, she was drawn very anti-traditional superheroes. She was shown she had a teenage figure. She wasn't drawn busty, and she wasn't wearing skin tight clothing. She was drawn wearing a t-shirt over baggy pants, which I personally didn't like as a costume, not because I didn't think it made sense for her, but because I wanted her to become as iconic as Spider-Man, and it's hard to do that when you look like you're wearing street clothes. And so it wasn't until after her series was canceled that they started putting her in skin tight outfits. And then even had her have a comic where she's in a skin tight outfit and says, "You know what? I'm just going to call myself Spider-Girl now." Like she just flat out says it.
I know that in the chapter I'm thinking of, so it's chapter 10, Anya Sofia Araña Corazon, the interwebbings and Mexican recanonization of Spider-Girl by Isabel Millan. I forget when in the publication history, so let me back up for a little bit. But at some point, she looks at some of the cover art in particular, used for the character. And cover art is its own thing, right? I mean,
very often very different from what's inside the book.
But yeah, I mean, it's a part of that dialogue around like spider folk, right? And how we have so many different versions of spider - insert identity, right?
Yep.
Whether that's any of the Spider-Men, right, or Spider Noir or Spider Punk or any of them, right? Like, and
I have an image here. Look of
So that first, the cover art does show her very busty, but in the book she just was. It was a different artist, I think, and they had her drawn different. middle one actually looks like a different Spider Girl, but the rest are her.
I think
Actually,
so.
I think that one on the far left is the one that's used. Is one of the ones that's used.
Yeah, that's
in-
that's definitely the cover of one of the
Yeah.
early books. So you're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
I just remember she did dress like a teenager, so there was
Yeah.
that. But yeah, I see
Yeah.
what you're saying.
But there's the rhetoric of the cover art, right? And that's supposed to gain the attention of people, as an advertising piece.
That's the
But
truth.
I mean, you get into gender and away from the Latino representation for a second. And there was the Emma Frost series. The Emma Frost series was entirely about Emma Frost when she was a teenager, but every single cover was Greg Land art with her legs open on the cover. Every single cover. And even though on the inside it was her when she was like 14 trying to figure things out, on the cover there she is at age 30 in a bikini, and it was like that was a choice.
Yeah,
but that's a whole other thing.
But yeah. So the other thing that comes to mind about Aranya is that there's a lot of politics around the why, right?
Yep.
Because her name is, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but her name proper is Anya with the tilde, right?
Yes, it would be.
The Y is, well, I think she even says that she uses the Y as a way of sort of placating English speakers, right? And so that's an interesting point, because there is what's the term I'm looking for? There's a meta perception that Latinos often have to engage with, as do a lot of other minority groups and marginalized peoples. And that is, meta perception is the idea that we are aware of how other people perceive us, and so we modify accordingly, right? It's sort of related to the idea of like the double consciousness from W.E.B. Du Bois and the African-American experience.
Yeah.
But that the politics around the Y and the Enya are very much reflective of a certain lived experience.
And, we talk about that. We talk about, before we started recording, we're talking about our own names, and I've said several times that I don't like the name Kevin because, the name Garcia is basically the Spanish Smith. It's like the most common Mexican last name. And yet my first name, you cannot get any whiter, and it does not translate to Spanish. And it's always driven me nuts. People are like, why don't you change it? And I'm like, at this point, I branded it. At this point, I've got the website. Trust me, the works.
Yeah.
And in El Salvador, I knew like 3 Kevins. Their kids are named Kevin.
Were they Kevin or Kevin? Yeah,
No, Kevin.
My great grandmother always
El
called me
Kevin.
Kevin. Kevin.
El Kevin. El Kevinche. I know a guy named Douglas, Jefferson,
There you go.
like that. Like these names. El Wilmer.
Yeah, I have
Well,
a cousin
Wilmer.
named Hillary,
Wilmer.
who was named after Hillary Clinton, but her mother didn't speak in English. This was when Hillary was first running for president, and her mother had difficulty saying her name in English. And I'm like, well, just say Hilaria in Spanish, But she really wanted to be Hillary, so
I always appreciated Junior as a name.
oh yeah.
I've known a couple
Yeah. Just
Latino families
easy.
with juniors. Yeah.
It's easy, man. Like I'm a junior technically.
Uh-huh.
My dad's name is Freddie,
Mhm.
but they spelled it wrong apparently in my dad's eyes. So my name, tell you a quick story. So my name's Fredie,
Mhm.
and my middle name is Stanley. So one day I asked my mom, my name's Freddie Stanley Mejia. Like, where do these names come from? Well, your dad's name is Freddie. It's not Federico. It's not Alfredo. Nope, it's Freddie. In El Salvador, Freddie, right? So, Stanley. That's what they say, Stanley. They go, what is this? Oh, because your mom had Stanley pots and pans, and I had Stanley tools. And so I correlated it with a strong, sturdy metal. So that's why
yeah.
I'm named Stanley.
Now,
And then told my mom, is this true? She goes, he's fucking full of shit. He's like the name. So there you go. That's how my name came up.
Story with my name supposedly was that I was the first grandchild born, and that my grandmother came running into the room saying he needs to have a white name or he'll never get a job. Now she denied that till the day she died, but
America.
I fully believe she said that.
that feels right. That feels like a
does.
story I've heard.
Also, feels like something she would have said too.
My middle name is
Yeah.
Arnoldo, and I've never met another Arnoldo in my life, and I'm not sure that's a
Arnoldo or
Latino name.
Arnaldo?
Arnoldo. Arnold O.
Wow, that's unique.
Yeah, exactly. I've never known another Latino with that name. I think my parents were screwing with me. That's all
I
right.
don't know. But
Francisco
here we
Ramon.
are. Names
Well,
matter.
speaking of
Mr.
names
Vibe.
and whether or not they meet the vibe check,
Mhm.
I want
Ooh.
to talk about DC because I'm not a big DC guy, but I want to talk real quick about DC's. The one they always trot out, say, no, look, we've always had Latino representation, and they're like,
Mhm.
look at vibe, because what says Latino more than a guy whose powers are based on dance music?
Right.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Right.
Like you could see right there where that's going.
He was one of the best parts of the Flash show, though.
I've heard good things. Yeah,
He was
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
I didn't
He
watch the
was
show.
fucking cool, man. He
Yeah.
could teleport through different dimensions. He can find people. It's just super cool.
But I still feel like he was created specifically to be like, we want a Latino character, and they're like, what do Latinos do? They dance. All right, give him music powers.
Yep. That's
But
and
let me drop a question in here before we dive deeper, because John Avina makes a comic book with Avina Comics. The Paletero, like the last Paletero,
Mhm.
and he wrote this book. It's like a zombie apocalypse. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry, John. I'm butchering. I haven't read your book, but I remember the beats. It is pretty much he's the last Paletero, but he's like fighting off zombies or whatever, and he's embodying that image of a Latino Paletero pushing the cart, but he's the hero of the story. And John, being Latino, writes this character. We kind of laugh. Oh, cool. We accept it. That's kind of funny. Cool twist. But if someone else stepped in and
Look,
did the Paletero,
it's all context. That's the important part. I go
It
ahead.
is. No, I was going to say that it's kind of like the difference between going back to the Luke Cage example. Did y'all remember Dexter's Lab?
Yeah.
And what's his name? The creator, Genny Tartarovsky.
Yeah, I can't pronounce his name, but that guy.
He did a Luke
yeah,
Cage
he
run.
did. Yeah,
He did a Luke
Oh,
Cage run, and
okay.
it is all of the visual trappings of like Luke Cage from the early 70s with his art style that he did for Dexter's Laboratory. And it feels hollow. Like the Azzarello run felt offensive. This one just felt like it was all flash and no substance, for lack of a better term. And that's how sometimes these characters like Vibe come across. I've read an issue or two where he popped up. I really like the version that's on the CW because I feel like they fleshed out the character somewhat. They made him more than a one-note character.
Oh, he's 100. Like I've only
Yeah.
seen a few episodes of Flash. He's 100% fleshed out.
They actually deal with the idea of like the dichotomous home life of what it's like growing up in a Latino household versus having to navigate the real world. Like that's a thing that they deal with, albeit only in bits and spurts.
Yeah.
But and to your point about like the paletero, that's being in on the joke,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
That's not being the joke,
See,
if that makes sense.
This is why I say
There
context
you go.
matters. And I go back to the example of Blue Beetle, the movie, versus Ant-Man. And in Ant-Man, there was one Latino character, and
Mhm.
his car has the La Cucaracha noise.
Yep.
And as an audience member, I laughed at that because this is the little bit of representation we get, and it's a little nod to his culture. I'm like, you know what? Fine, I'll take it. It's funny. It's great. But
Right.
then in the Blue Beetle movie, the whole movie is about Latino culture. We have a whole family there. We're getting all this stuff. I'm really getting into it. And then the car has the La Cucaracha noise. And I'm like, and nobody comments on it. I really feel like it was added in post.
Mhm.
That was not needed there. We
Yeah.
already established culture. We're good. We're not doing a little nod of the hat to culture because it's an Ant-Man movie. No, this is a whole movie about Latinos. They did not need to put that song there. And it's still like I enjoyed every second of the family except when that song played.
Mhm.
That and when the uncle killed a guy.
I did like Luis in Ant-Man, but I also remember thinking that man played Cesar Chavez, and this is what he's doing.
He did. He went to space too.
I mean, you
I
could-
always thought Luis should have come in right at
Yes.
Endgame
Yes.
and given us the rundown of
No.
what's been happening since then.
We just needed to sit down between him and Scott Lang, and he just explains the entire Marvel universe up to that point. That's all we needed. And you know the
That'd
best
been
part?
so good.
I was actually at San Diego Comic-Con, and they played a clip. I swear I remember seeing a clip of just the actor giving a summary of the Marvel universe for the fans at San Diego. And I'm like, they need that. They need that.
I have been wanting slice of life vignettes from Marvel for so long, and Luis was the character to do it.
That'd be the way to go, man.
Yeah.
Why can't we do slice of life like these characters? It'd be fun.
Yeah.
Speaking of slice of life,
Oh, Mr.
as,
What is
as,
this?
as a kid reading comic books, in the 80s and early 90s, I noticed something. I noticed that every time there was an X-Men character, a mutant, who was not generic white bread character, they had to explain where they were from. If they were Latino, they were from Brazil. They were from Mexico. If he's got of German descent, no, he's from Germany. He's not of German descent. So they always had to be from. Even Storm, who's born in the U.S., was raised in Africa. That explains why she's black.
Yeah.
So I noticed. No, I'm not kidding.
No, you're right. You're right.
So when Generation X came out, and they introduced this kid called Skin, who was from from Los Angeles. This was the first time where I felt like, oh my gosh, there's a mutant in the X-Men who is Mexican American, and he is actually from the U.S. And again, there's nothing wrong with immigration. I love having representation of that, but the idea was that was the only representation we were getting in X-Men comics. The only representation we're getting was, in fact, Jubilee was the only other example of somebody who was not white and was born in the U.S. And so Skin came out. Now Skin, once you get his background, he's literally a ex-gangster from East LA. That's literally his origin in the early 90s. And the funniest part is when you read, I actually interviewed Scott Lobdell about it once, but when you look at why he created the character, he's like, flat out, I was dating a Latina at the time, and I decided, like he just says that flat out. But honestly, look, while his life story wasn't my life story, growing up in Brownsville, I did know people who did grow up in gangs. So at least this was closer to something that I recognized than, a millionaire from Brazil, like Sunspot. I was like, hey, here is something that feels more like my story. Even if it's not my story, it's closer.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think about that?
This character now.
Yeah, like what do you think about that idea of this? They introduced this guy, but he's a gangster.
Yeah, so it's I like to think that progress is a series of problematic steps forward. Right?
That's how I put it.
And that's it's like, yeah, so you introduce a character and you use all these tropes. I'm sure you said he's from LA, he's a gangster, he's probably from East LA
East LA. Yeah. And not only that though, but in his official biography, they originally said he was Puerto Rican. And I'm not saying there can't be Puerto Ricans in East LA, but like
that's a far-flung part of the diaspora.
Yeah, there was nobody, there were no Latinos in the room when they were writing this character in the beginning.
No, there weren't. So we can't. Because someone went, he's Mexican. No, we can't do that. They'll think we're racist. Let's make.
Actually, I think what happened is Scott Lobdell's girlfriend was Puerto Rican, so he just said she was Puerto Rican.
So yeah. I mean, that's the thing is like these characters are often like they're toeholds, right? Like they're just ways of getting in the door. I like to use the example also of Black Panther, right? From Kirby and Lee was a collection of what's referred to as dark continent stereotypes.
Yep, definitely.
Right.
I read a lot of pulp stories. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and so it's just he without that character, we don't get the current MCU that we have now, right? Same thing with characters like this. Like you can probably draw a through line from a character like this to say Robbie Reyes, right?
Definitely,
so
easily.
Yeah.
Because Robbie Reyes also from East LA, I believe. But the idea is that there's a lot more dimension to him than just saying, oh, well, he's a gang member. That's his whole origin. We're done now.
Yeah.
And by the way, there was a lot more to Skin than that, but that was the bulk of it,
Right.
So he was one of my favorites growing up. There's newer characters that I'm not as familiar with. I think, Freddie, this is one of the ones you had mentioned.
Yeah.
From DC.
Azúcar, because I love Batman. And I always kind of hung back and go like, is the only Latino I have to really look forward to and seeing in these books is Bane. And even then,
and he's Scottish in the movies.
No,
exactly,
actually, he's different. I figured out who it is. Tom Hardy's version of Bane is based on a Romani.
That actually would make some kind of sense.
He's based on a specific Romani leader who was a bare knuckle boxer, and that's because I have racked my brain over where that comes from. I'm sorry, Freddie.
It sounded like a bad Scottish accent.
You're there, man.
We walked into that one. It's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. But that's like when I read. Well, I'll get to it. But with Azúcar is a character that I really like because we met her very briefly. I think it was Suicide Squad and El Diablo, right?
Yeah.
And El Diablo was a Latino evil. He's a devil, like he's evil Latino, devil, Diablo, whatever. But Azúcar became like this, like super soldier. You know what I mean? Like she has telepathy and skull sense, and she's a badass. And I really like that she was not the atypical Latina you would see in these books, right? I mean,
Mhm.
yes, she's sexualized and what have you, right? Because that's what the time they were written. I know we'll get to that. But her abilities, she was smart as hell. She was a leader. She kicked ass, and she was in the DC universe. And so when Asuka came through, I was really excited for this character. But they haven't really done much with her.
If you told me about a Latina, if you told me about a female super character, powered individual whose name was Sugar, I would think that's pretty condescending. But honestly, I don't know. Like I kind of get it. Especially because of, I mean, I guess the reference to like sugar skulls, right? So with the Calavera paint. But yeah, no, this looks interesting. And honestly, it reminds me of there's a comic, I think it's an indie comic called Lady Mechanica.
I've seen that. I've seen the cover.
No,
Yeah, there's one or two stories where they go into like Mexico and they have a Dia de los Muertos thing, and everything is like turned up to 11 in terms of like the art and the and things like that and the intricacy of it. It's a bit over the top, but this, like, I could actually see like one of my sisters painting their face like that.
And look, she is over the top, but I'm not going to lie. There's a big part of me that likes the fact that she's got a matador jacket.
Yeah.
That is the colors of the Mexican flag.
cool design, man.
And that she's got this whole La Catrina aesthetic going on,
Mhm.
you know? So it's like, yeah, it's a lot of weird stereotypes put together, but it works and it says exactly what it needs to say. But
Yeah.
my
because she
fear with
has
this,
skull sense.
yeah.
That's her Spidey sense.
But my fear
Oh,
with this
no.
kind of character is that they just kind of end up in the background, you know,
Yeah.
like you could either make her a new Deadpool or she
Mhm.
could just be one of 50 bad guys in the background, you know?
I think in that vein, I think that folks often forget that there is a right amount of camp that goes into these characters, right?
It's
I
a
mean, I should
careful
have said,
balance.
I read a fascinating book chapter about how Frank Castle, the Punisher, is male drag.
Yeah, that actually
Hmm.
tracks. That tracks
Yeah,
very
because
much.
everything he does
Yeah.
is campy.
especially
Everything.
the early years where it was like over the top masculinity.
Well, in this case, they were talking about the Netflix show, and like he is, you know, from the way he walks and talks and chews and like everything, and the way he murders people is so over the top, right? There's a lot of camp to it, and
I
that's
think the
hard.
Thomas
with,
Jane movie even more so.
that movie could have been so good.
Yeah.
His movie Dirty Laundry was a better version of it, right?
I still feel bad for Thomas Jane because he to this day wishes he was still Punisher. Anyway, sorry.
Anyway, you know, he wrote a comic book. Anyway, so, but yeah, like, but when it comes to like minority characters, like camp can easily become derisive, right? And so this, I don't know, like I have to read more, but it feels right.
All right. Next up, also from DC, Aztec, the Ultimate Man, which I'll be honest, I know nothing about him except I liked his name and design. He came out when I was busy reading comics, but this is around the time they killed off all the Green Lanterns, so I just kind of gave up on DC. But still, if you're going to be pulling from common mythological tropes, you could do worse.
I feel like I've seen this man painted on the inside of a Mexican restaurant.
Yeah,
On a calendar, holding a dead lady with a feather in her hair.
he's
Right,
honestly had like only a handful of appearances. They killed him off. There was a newer version recently who I guess the Ultimate Woman now.
Yeah.
But still Aztec, and it's interesting. But talking
Where do
about
they pull from, right? Like we said earlier, like,
Yeah.
hey, we needed a Latino looking Batman / Iron Man /
well, they
Black
also go
Panther.
for this whole like Empire of the Sun kind of thing, which is really
Yeah.
more of Inca than Aztec. But like, you know, they tried.
semantics.
Next up, we have Fire, who is one of the bigger DC heroines. She's shown up in a lot of stuff, and she is Brazilian. But it does go into what we were saying earlier about where they overly sexualize characters, especially when they are like Latina or just anything that is, quote, exotic. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. A lot of these characters have been light skinned so far.
Yes, they have. And I think as we go through it, we get before I go to the next one, do you think else you want to have to say on Fire?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
I think we're
Okay,
let's see,
because
move forward.
I wanted to stop on Firebird for a second.
Okay.
This is a woman who's been an Avenger. She's probably one of the more powerful of the Avengers. I mean, that's saying a lot right there. She has this incredible control over fire that puts her not on par with Phoenix, really, but she can do a lot of stuff with it, right? And she can also heal people, all kinds of great stuff. But the big thing about her that gets me is that she was created to be a parody of a Catholic.
Oh,
Because she immediately gets her powers and believes that she has been blessed by God, and now God has told her to go save people. And then later on, we find out that her powers came because some drunk aliens are flying overboard, pulled the chute on their garbage disposal, happened to land on her, and all of the alien chemicals gave her powers. And she's like, no, okay, it's still God. It's God working through mysterious ways.
I mean,
and then she'll meet Thor, and she'll be like, no, you are not a God. You cannot call yourself that because there is only Jesus Cristo. And she is very much like, and now I read a recent comic. They did, Marvel's been doing these Marvel Voices comics lately. I'm sure you've heard of those, where they bring in people of communities to write them. And there's a Firebird story in one of them that is actually good. It's like one of the only good Firebird stories I've ever read. But like a lot of her early stories are just like, she thinks that Catholicism is the real, and it's like,
I mean, as a Catholic, I can reconcile aliens dropping space junk on people and giving them powers as being consistent with my understanding of God. So, like,
Yeah, God's big, man. God's everywhere. If you're only right here, you're underestimating it.
As Paul put it, God is in the space trash. So she looks like she's uncomfortable as she's standing there.
Well, to be fair,
first thing that stood out to me.
To be fair, this is from Marvel's 1990 Master Edition handbook, where all the characters were drawn to see every part of their costume, which looks so weird. Be honest, it's not natural. And she's had better costumes. But I do want to touch on what you said a second ago about how all the characters we looked at so far have been light skinned, because I think you get a variety of things where you get like either everybody's drawn white, which is very common, or you get a lot of characters who they decided certain shades mean that character. So like Forge in the 80s, drawn bright red, like pinkish red, right? Shang-Chi in the 70s, as yellow as Firebird's costume.
Right.
And then when they would have a Latino, they would have them gray because they figured, well, they're not black and they're not white, so let's make them gray. And gray became the standard color for a lot of Latinos. One that really, actually, I think I have it here somewhere. One that really gets me, I don't have it here, is, do I have it? Here we go. Sangre. Sangre is a character from Thor. And she only really had like 2 or 3 appearances. Yes, it's right there, 2 appearances. She had 2 appearances. And in her first appearance, she was an extremely dark-skinned Latina. Her son had died in an act of violence. So even though she is a cop, she has a side gig, basically being the Punisher. She goes after people, and she's so good that she's able to outfight one of the Thor characters who has Thor's powers, long story. And Punisher watches her from a distance and says she has potential. And that's her first appearance. Now, in her second appearance, same writing, same skill that she has and everything, but now she's drawn whiter than me. And I do not understand what happened between those 2 appearances that were 5 issues apart, where she went from being a very, very dark-skinned Latina to being extremely white. And it's just like, look, if we're going to have her appear more than once, we got to fix that.
She must have found Jesus. I don't know what to tell you. Like,
I don't know. Maybe it's one of those marketing things. Like, you know what?
Yeah.
Who made her lighter skinned? It may work better.
I wonder, maybe it was a printing error.
It might have been a coloring error, but some editor should have caught it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
On that note, you brought up earlier Hector Ayala, not Marvel's first Latino superhero, but definitely the most well-known, the one they would always trot out for years until more recently with Robbie Reyes and those guys.
And one got killed by the cops.
Yes. Brian and Michael Bendis wrote that one.
Permanently dead.
Yes.
Like,
one of the few permanently dead characters in comics.
Yeah.
Right?
But what's really weird for me is after they killed him, they brought in his niece to be the new White Tiger. And then a few years later, they brought in his niece to be the new White Tiger.
Yep.
The 2 writers did not know about the other characters, so now there are 2 White Tigers that are both his niece. Nieces.
Nisai, I think.
Nisai? Yeah, it's the proper plural. So.
Nieces.
So did you have something you want to say about White Tiger earlier, though?
Yeah, so White Tiger is kind of interesting because he started in 1975. He's a part of that kung fu,
the fad.
fetishizing that's
Yeah.
happening
Yeah.
at that
The
point, right?
exploitation of martial arts.
Right. Where we also get like Danny Rand and
Yep.
all kinds of other folks. I think there was the Karate Kid also.
Yeah, that's
for
in
a little while
DC.
there.
Well, that was in DC had the Karate Kid.
That was DC.
The Judo Master was Charlton, but DC bought them.
Right.
And both, by the way, both Karate Kid and Judo Master were white guys that knew martial arts. That what made them cool. What's interesting about Ayala is his origin. Okay, this is his actual origin. So there were these three guys, one Asian guy, one white guy, one black guy, who had three items called that gave them totems of the tiger, and together they were the sons of the tiger. And when they had these items, they knew martial arts. Well, one day they all decided we're going to quit being superheroes. They literally threw their amulets out the window. They landed in a trash can. Hector Ayala walks by the trash can and goes, "I'll pick those up." So his origin is he found somebody's superpowers in a trash can because they threw them out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, trash. God is in the trash, right? Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because if I'm not mistaken, Ayala died. He was running from the police, but it was
he was in a trial.
It was on trial, right?
Yeah,
and
he was
Matt
on trial.
Murdock was defending him, and the trial was not going to go his way, right?
Yep.
Like, yeah, and so it's always curious to me when you have these permanent deaths because they don't happen often, right?
Yep.
It's like Bill Foster, right? Being killed,
God, that one still annoys me.
It's dumb. It's bad, and to be killed by a fake Thor, right?
Yeah, not killed by fake Thor, given a sham of a funeral in a really poorly thought out book, and then to introduce his nephew as the new Giant Man, whose name is Tom.
No,
Right?
Yes, Tom Foster is the new Goliath.
Yeah.
I mean, that's almost as bad as having a character named Jefferson Davis, who's also a black man.
Which is also Brian Michael Bendis.
I swear like Brian Michael Bendis. I don't know if he's legitimately trying to do good things.
No, he is legitimately trying to do good things,
but he's just bad at it.
Yes. It's like Chris Claremont, but I think Chris Claremont had on average a little bit more successes. It's just that so Brian Michael Bendis adopted one of his adopted, I don't know, one or both of his adopted kids are black, and he wanted to make sure there were black superheroes that they could look up to, and he makes Miles Morales, and it has to have been an inside joke for him that because like his Miles is Miles Morales, but his dad's name is Davis, so Miles could have been Miles Davis, but instead he has his mom's name. So what's his dad's name? Jefferson Davis, and that has to have also been an inside joke.
That there's no
why
way.
Why would you do that? Why would you?
Right. And my daughter is who's preschool age is really interested. She loves Spidey and Friends, and her favorite characters are Ghost Spider, right? Gwen Stacy.
Yeah.
Which is she called Ghost Spider because Gwen Stacy's dead? Is that...
No, it's not because Gwen Stacy's dead. It's because it's a long, convoluted story. But they really just didn't want to call her Spider Woman anymore, so they tried to give her a new name. That's the real reason.
So she loves Gwen Stacy, and she also loves Officer Morales. And I was like, oh, cool. And I thought, I have some comics with these characters. Nope, you can't read them. They're not. There's no story arcs I know of with those characters that are not.
There are now.
Oh, there are now.
If you read the current run of Miles Morales Spider-Man, his dad is named Officer Morales.
Okay.
His name is Jefferson Morales. Excuse me, hiccup. So they fixed it eventually again by bringing in people of color to be the writers, but they fixed it eventually.
Salad and Ahmed's run of Miles Morales was the first time I believe that character was brown.
Wait, believed. Okay, I thought you were talking about like the coloring wise. I was like,
no. I mean, like in terms of, like this. Okay, this is actually like a Latino character.
Well, one thing my partner brings up a lot is that they always present him as either being the black Spider-Man or the Puerto Rican Spider-Man. And she's like, there are Afro-Latinos in Puerto Rico, right? It's like,
yeah,
it was an attempt. Yeah. On that note, I want to touch base on what I think has been one of the more successful attempts, and that's the modern Blue Beetle. I already mentioned that I did enjoy the movie. The superhero part of the movie was generic superhero movie in the most generic sense, but the family part of the movie was something that I hadn't seen in an action movie, and that was a Latino family that feels real.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the modern Blue Beetle?
So this is one of those characters that I've read more about than I've actually read. Right.
Fair enough.
Going back to like
true for me too.
book I mentioned earlier about graphic borders, there's a great chapter called "The Alien is Here to Stay: Otherness, Anti-Assimilation, and Empowerment." And
I'm sorry, I'm laughing at how that title works with Blue Beetle so well.
No, and that's
Right.
it's about Blue Beetle.
I
right?
know. That's why I'm laughing. It's a really well done title.
It is, and like they talk about how in the comics there's the immigration narrative that keeps popping up a few different times because he keeps getting the powers make him black out. He wakes up in Mexico, and has to make his way back across the border at least a couple times. But what I liked about the movie was that it underscores the idea of what if society conformed to the marginalized, right? Because his suit and obviously I forget, do they get into the movie that this is like a piece of colonial technology?
They don't talk about where it came from.
No.
No.
Right. So but I mean, if you know,
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
like,
It's hinted at, but it only
it's
hints.
this Blue Beetle is here to like help colonize the planet, right? So we have like we have a larger than life a force that is of a society that is latching onto a minority figure, and it adapts to him. He doesn't try to use his powers to adapt to society the way that we see with characters like Clark Kent or Peter Parker, who become reporters, right? They use their powers to advance within a pre-existing social structure. With Jaime Reyes, the benefit is that the armor as a stand-in for like society kind of fits to his body, and that's where he gets his powers from. And I think that's a cool message.
I think it's cool. We had to interview the director of Blue Beetle, and when we sat down and talked, his focus was on the fact that we need this to succeed in order to have more, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole thing with all of these books, movies, what have you. But the fact that this movie, like Kevin said, like, yeah, there were a couple little blips, you want to call them that we kind of look at, but the film itself and how he said it, the care he took with the writer, of course, and him, everything from the music to the clothing, to the family themselves. It wasn't just a solo hero movie. It was a family movie, right? The family are all heroes in here, which is very Latino. They're all metidos. They're always in your business. They're always trying to help you. And that made the movie just feel more Latino to me, just the family inclusion. So I really appreciate what he did for that film.
And the texturing with things like, El Chapulín Colorado, right? There's 3 people in any given movie theater who are going to know that reference, and it's for them, right?
Right.
Yes. Oh man,
Exactly.
I love that so much. In fact, my friend, a friend of mine sent me a spoiler of that scene beforehand, and I'm like, I don't mind that it was spoiled because I was suddenly very excited to see this movie. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned Chapulín Colorado because Marvel actually has that character unofficially, serial numbers scratched off in the Marvel universe.
Really?
She was designed by a Mexican artist, Humberto Ramos, originally called the Red Locust, although he eventually said, can we just take the red part off because that was a little bit too much on the nose. So now she's just called the Locust, but she is always just like hyper positive, always like, we can do it. It's all about saving people. She's got a little heart on her costume that's like from her grandmother. It's all about like the goodness of who you could be and sharing that to others. And I'm like, I'm down for this. I like that character.
All right.
There she is.
I also appreciate that even though it's a little bit copyright infringy, I do appreciate the nod to Chapulín in this character, the Locust at Marvel.
Yeah.
Now Freedy, I called you Freedy because the freaking Siri calls you Freedy. Freddie,
Relying on Siri too much, man.
Vulcan, I do. Every time I drive, I text that way. Vulcan's character you want to put on here. What do you tell us about Vulcan?
Oh man, Vulcan's cool as well. Like I think the fact that he comes off as this like Roman mythology, re-embodied into a Latino, which I really dig, because everybody's always up in arms about the Roman Empire, the Greek gods, all that stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And here we are having a Latino take on Vulcan, that moniker, and he's a badass. He just has a sword and fire and he flies and he's just a badass. And I think that more people need to see this character and we need to take on these mantles. Why can't we have an Athena that is a Latina? Latina de Athena? Athena de Latina?
I like it.
The two on the nose?
Yeah.
But you know what gets me with these kind of characters is there's always going to be that contingent that starts complaining, saying, well, he can't be Latino and be the Roman hero. But like they may have previously had like an Irish American guy be the Roman hero, and they didn't care. They care when it's when he's brown.
Well, and if I can speak from a place of credibility with my PhD, fuck them. So, no, but honestly, so two things occur to me with this,
Yeah.
right? So, like on the one hand, like, oh, it's cool to have a Latino character who his ethnicity and his race is not his superpower, right?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
so often that is the case. But on the other hand, right, Vulcan is the Roman god answer to Hephaestus, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
most of us know Latinos with Greek or Roman names, right? Aurelio, Heraclio, Augustine, Constantine, like the.
I've known people named Ovidio.
Really? That's all right. Hell
Yep.
yeah.
Did not like his name, but he did
no.
not. I thought it was a cool name.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a good name. I mean, come on, Ovid ain't that bad.
No, that's what I said.
Yeah.
One of the great poets.
So like I if you know, again, that feels like one of those things like, well, if you know, you know, right? That's actually that kind of works, you know. So
Emociones trágicas que vuelven el corazón, que hacen que todo sea más que una canciones melodiosas que creas al actuar, encadenando mi corazón con tu dulce letra al hablar, con tu dulce letra al hablar.
There's a minor. My whole thing here was to find a lot of very minor characters, and you talk about characters whose superpowers are not based on their ethnicity. And this is a really blurry picture. I'm sorry about that. But there is a really beautiful comic that only lasted, I think, 6 issues before it got 8 issues. Sorry, there you go, 8 issues before it got canceled. Called Weird World, and the whole thing is like. They did a mishmash of every fantasy world ever put together in one place, and all of the magical creatures just don't get along well. Well, this girl is this teenage girl whose mother committed suicide, and she's taking her mother's ashes back to wherever her mother wanted to be her ashes spread, but she did not have a good relationship with her mom. And then her plane crashes into Weird World. So now she's a human girl in this world. And what's fascinating to me is that all of her adventures are based around the fantasy of the world, but all of her personal struggle is about this estranged relationship she had with her mother, who is of Mexican descent. She was going back to Mexico actually to deliver the mother's ashes, and that was to me it was beautiful that her culture was such a part of her character, but not a defining part of her comic, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's exactly what you were talking about.
yeah. Yeah, it's it becomes texturing and detail and not the crutch that you lean on to tell the story. Yeah.
And by the way, I want to point out that I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with having a character who's Mexican and is based around Mexican symbolism, but they don't all have to be.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
On that note,
Love Eva.
Yep. Here's a character created by a friend of the show, Terry Blas. He did the Reptile miniseries, which really, really impressed me because he took a character that I'll be honest with you, I never really liked. He wasn't a bad character. He was just uninteresting. And then he gave him...
No, it was a really cool character that just was ignored.
Sure. But what Terry did was he gave Reptile a family so you could feel like it was a real, kind of like what they did with Blue Beetle in the movie, where the family became part of the story. And what I thought was really neat about the family that Terry wrote is that it felt authentic without being a stereotype. For example, he's got a grandfather who spends all day playing World of Warcraft. Like, why can't you have a Mexican grandfather that spends, like, literally his grandfather's from Mexico, but lives here in the States and just plays World of Warcraft every day? And it's like, why can't he? Why not?
Sure.
And his cousin ends up becoming a sorceress. She's a teenager who's now going to school under Doctor Strange and Dr. Voodoo, learning how to become a sorceress. So I think it's pretty cool.
Is Brother Voodoo Dr. Voodoo, is he the Sorcerer Supreme right now?
No, that's okay. So I personally
Buckle up.
okay. So look, I've talked. I have. I know other people that have told me, from their culture, they have no problem calling him Dr. Voodoo or Brother Voodoo. I think it's weird they'd be calling like Daredevil Captain Catholic. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. No,
I think it's
very much on the nose.
I think it's weird. But that being said, Brian Michael Bendis made him the Sorcerer Supreme for a while, which I remember at the time was like, why are you doing this? Because you're going to give it back to Doctor Strange later. And I don't like the optics of taking it from the black guy and giving it back to the white guy. But yeah, Doctor Strange is currently the Sorcerer Supreme, and Dr. Voodoo is what he goes by now, is currently the headmaster of the Strange Academy. So he is the one teaching the next generation of sorcerers.
Yeah, there's a great book called Unstable Masks, Superheroes in Whiteness. And the first chapter in that edited anthology is all about how whiteness recenters itself in these narratives. The case they use is Sam Wilson and Steve Rogers. But yeah, it always goes back to it, unfortunately. Anyway.
See, I will say that in the case of Sam Wilson or Rhodey from Iron Man, we knew it was going to go back to the white guy, but at least we got a new hero out of it.
Sure.
What troubles me with Dr. Voodoo is that he was already a superhero.
Right.
So it wasn't like, oh, we got a new hero out of this deal. He was already his own hero. You just made him now secondary to Doctor Strange when he wasn't before.
It's almost like saying you're flirting with making him important.
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. But back on Terry Bloss's characters, he made Ava, but he also made Ava's brother, Julian, who has, I don't remember exactly why he has his powers, but he can summon an energy macoitl, and that's pretty cool. And
I'm
also,
impressed that you could say that. I have struggled with it for years.
Some days I can say it, some days I can't. And I have a lot of friends who speak it more naturally than I do.
Right.
And whenever they're in the room, I'm like, how is it? But the other big thing about Julian is that his sexuality is also a big part of his identity. He's very proud to be gay. So that's a big part of his character. And I think that's also, again, you don't have to be one thing. You don't have to be, you're the Mexican hero,
Yeah.
No, I think that's the issue that we come across, right? Where we're kind of pigeonholed into one thing. Like one of the primos in the past said that, was it? Who wrote Danny Starboy? No, Andy Starboy. Danny Calvo. He's now with Grimcore Comics.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know him.
He wrote Andy Starboy, which is a great book, by the way, really fun. He also wrote Tenok, God of Fire.
Yeah.
Well,
I think he pronounced it Tenoch, which is legitimate as well.
Tenok.
I think that's how he said it. But either way, yeah.
But what I'm getting to is that we discussed the fact that we get excited about, me personally and my primos too, and almost everybody, whenever we get Latinos in sci-fi, because we've always been told to look to the ground agriculturally. We've always been told to be the ones that are, workers. We're looking to the ground, culturally, plants grow and fix things. But when we get to the fact that we can get to the stars and we can get to the sky and be something completely different, I've always made the argument that I want to see a Latino X-Files, and like, why? But we don't have to be blatantly throw it in somebody's face. It just is, that we have Latinos that are also experiencing weird kooky shit,
I have always appreciated that, Star Wars has been a big champion of that, showing us that you can have Latinos in space that are also drug dealers.
I thought you were going somewhere else with that.
Real,
but yeah, you were right.
Look, they made Poe a spice smuggler. All right. For years, I was like riding hard on the idea that Chewie is one of us because who doesn't know someone named Chewie who fits some of those profiles? But then
he's a mechanic.
Isn't Cassian Andor? Isn't his whole thing just illegally breaking into places like other countries?
He's a smuggler and a criminal. Yeah, and then it's one of the cartoons they have other spice runners who are like coded as Latino. It's a thing.
So on that note, Marvel has these guys called the Eternals, who are these godlike humans that have been around for millions of years before humanity. And when Jack Kirby first drew them, he drew most of them as white because this is a guy that grew up in the 20s and 30s, and when he thinks of perfect humans. They were blonde because that's what he was told to think, even though he's, Jewish man himself. But he changed it over the years. He would add characters to his godlike people, so they were more diverse, a bit at a time. Well, after Kirby left the Eternals, somebody's like, you know what? We need some Mexican Eternals. So what do the Mexican Eternals do? They are luchadors. El Vampiro, who is one of the few Eternals that does not have a real name, is only known by his luchador name. He fights a deviant who goes by El Toro Rojo. And that's like literally every appearance of theirs is just, we are luchadors and this is what we do. Mm-hmm. So, hey, we got to be space gods. Does that count? Mm-hmm. And then Marvel recently introduced a character called EP6, which is a nice pun. But it is about it's a Latina kid from LA that gets a magical mask, which is obviously a luchador mask. And when he puts it on, he becomes a gorilla. So that's a thing.
As we all do.
Was that Speedball?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yes, that is Speedball, but from a dimension where everybody in that dimension is a monkey.
So just a quick side note. I'm friends with some guys who do a podcast called A Geek History of Time, right?
Yeah.
And they do deep dives of a given thing of nerddom. And by deep dives, I mean like 6 or 7 2-hour episodes on these things, right? And I
let them know I'm available.
Listen, I'm going to hook you up. And Damien Harmony, is Damien Harmony and Ed Blaylock, and Damien, they're both high school and middle school teachers. I
don't know what that's like.
Yeah, well, it's a special circle of hell, and
it really is.
Damien is a huge fan of Speedball. We did, I think, 5 episodes on Civil War, and its connection to Speedball as the instigator and his storyline throughout.
So horrible.
And how Peter Parker operates as a neoliberal or a more modern liberal perspective on law enforcement.
That is 100% accurate.
And
we had a deep dive of that book too.
Yeah, we did do.
We didn't go in depth.
No, we did one episode, but it was a good episode.
We didn't do 7 hours.
I really enjoyed working with Damien, but I thought I escaped Speedball, and here he is yet again.
No, he's going to grow up. Soulfire is a character that my friend keeps picking on me because I am his only fan in the entire universe. He only had 2 appearances, but I'm just going to really quick say why I love him. First off, he is a Latino guy from New York. As a kid, he was possessed by hundreds of demons, just as you do. They were able to get all of them out but one, as happens. And when that one gets activated, when he's like, I don't know, 18, 19 at this point, he becomes this, which is basically a cross between the Hulk and Ghost Rider, right? But what's great about him is that once he still has his mind in charge of this body, he's just a chill dude. Like literally, like he's like, what has happened? He's fighting a demon possessed woman. He's like, I just want to be home playing Nintendo. And then the cops are like, what happened here? Don't ask me, dude. I'm like, he's just a chill guy, and yet he looks like that.
I was going to say this is like if Ghost Rider were a Chippendale.
Yes, he looks like that.
But also, like I would read a comic that's just him and Blob from the X-Men just hanging out.
Oh yes, Marvel. I want to write Soulfire comics. Let me write Soulfire comics. I could do so much with this guy.
I want him trying to get a table at a busy Sunday brunch restaurant. Like that would be the best.
Also, are those eyes on his pecs?
No, those are just really intense nipples.
Because they look like scowling eyes, and they
do.
They stare into my soul. I don't feel comfortable.
Chimera is a new character. I don't really know much about her. She only had 1 appearance, but she is Latina. That's literally all we know about her so far. But what I wanted to show you really was Pedro the Peril, who is, as far as I am aware, Marvel's very first Latino hero. He appeared in 1942 in Young Allies, which is a comic that also included one of Marvel's first Black heroes, who was known as Whitewash Jones. Now, just to be clear, Bucky is Captain America's sidekick. Bucky had sidekicks, and one of them was named Whitewash Jones, which I've read a lot of his appearances, and my experiences with Whitewash Jones is either he is drawn like a human being, but written like a minstrel show, or he is drawn like the most racist image of a Black guy from the 40s you can think of, but written like a human being. Like I've not found a comic where he is written and drawn like a human being. But inside that comic is Pedro the Peril. Now, Pedro the Peril is obviously a humor comic that is based on the idea of the bandito, right?
Mhm.
And it's surprisingly not as bad as it looks, because
Tough sell, Kevin.
it's a
Mhm.
very tough sell. It's a very tough sell. But here's the thing: he is nowhere in the entire comic that he's in. He's only in one appearance. Is there over the top of that "this is it" language, which is every time somebody shows up who's Latino has that in the 40s.
Right.
He is when I describe him to somebody, I describe him like this. He's a bandit who wants to be the most dangerous bandit in the world, but he does that by going to a place, finding out people are sad because a rich guy is taking advantage of them. So he beats up the rich guy to make sure everybody can have candy and food. And everybody cheers him. And he goes, they're scared of me, right? And they're like, sure, Pedro. And then I explain it to somebody and they go, you tell me he's the Mexican Luffy? I'm like, yeah, basically he is. Like, he's like a guy who wants to be a pirate, but his version of being a pirate is helping people who are downtrodden.
That's surprising because he looks like if the Frito Bandito did a fusion dance with Emiliano Zapata.
Yes.
Right.
And the thing is also his wife, whose name is Bella Danya, but no, Bella Danya. It's spelled weird, but
Someone didn't know how to spell Bella. And okay.
No. But the thing is that she, in the one story that he's in, he's trying to stop this rich man who's taking advantage of the poor people. And he's not really sure how to do it because he's kind of a dork, kind of like Luffy. And she says, I have an idea. And he goes, no, you must stay home where it's safe. Be safe. I'll have my men protect you. Well, she goes to do it anyway. And she ends up being the one that actually saves the day, but lets him feel like he got the credit. So I'm like, it's a pretty standard, cartoon comedy story.
And it also references, not reference, but vice flip that with skin. The gray color.
Mhm.
Yes, they're definitely gray color skin that I was talking about earlier. I also say that he gets shot several times and the bullets just bounce off, so he's apparently bulletproof. So I'm counting him as the first Latino superhero of Marvel.
Like I think that scans, and this would have been what, the 1940s?
1942.
Right? Yeah. Okay. So and Bucky was a war criminal as a child soldier.
Well, that's a retcon. Back in the 40s, he just laughed and shot people. Now we find out that he was doing it under orders.
He was doing what works as a child.
Yes, he was.
Right.
But I mean, like, no, that's fascinating, especially because like the bandito is it was probably the most enduring like Latino stereotype, right? I mean, it's I think Charles Ramirez Berg puts it as like the proto stereotype for Latinos in American media. And it's still
Would the
going
contemporary be the cholo?
strong. Yeah. So one of the other cases he makes is that like basically gangsters are the modern day iterations of those stereotypes. And obviously, I mean, things have gotten a little better, but yeah, that's a fascinating cartoon right there.
The thing about that is that when you talk about the bandito stereotype, it goes around the world, and we have Speedy Gonzalez and a lot of the imagery there, but a lot of Latinos have embraced it. Like throughout Latin America, they love Speedy Gonzalez. Freddie, can you share the screen real quick? In Japan, there is Tequila Gundam.
Wait, what?
I love this.
Who?
Oh my god!
So in this particular Gundam,
This is not my favorite robot.
That's what I'm talking about.
I need to have one.
Yes,
I want one.
there are toys of it. So in this particular Gundam series, every country in the world has their own themed Gundam, and this is the Gundam from Mexico.
I don't even hate it. I'm not mad. This
Right?
is, yeah.
Is it animated?
That's how it's animated. Yeah, and that's how I feel about Pedro the Peril. Is that yes, he's a horrible stereotype, but he could have been worse. And I feel like there's still stuff you could do with him. I feel like you could have some fun with that.
It's weird. It's weirdly forward thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. If only by accident, but yeah.
100%. I looked up who the creator was. It is indeed a white guy. All of his other comics were the same kind of art style, same kind of humor, but about white guys. Thankfully, I didn't find any by him that were of black guys, because that would have gone exactly where it would have gone.
Mhm.
But we talked earlier about DC's first attempt at a Latino hero, and it was the Whip that I talked about earlier, which, and then you talked about Extraño, and let's get into that. What did you want to say about Extraño? This guy's from the 80s at DC.
Extraño is maybe my favorite iteration, or my favorite example of when It's the whole. Okay, let me back up for a second, and I'm gonna get a little technical here, but I think it's worth it. So, Stuart Hall was a scholar of cultural studies. He's often credited with being one of the founding fathers of cultural studies, and so he was a Jamaican-born British citizen who was a part of like the New Left in Britain in like the 1970s and whatnot. And so he basically said, as the former Marxists, now neo-Marxists, were looking at like, well, how does ideology and how do systems of thought inform society? He said, well, hey, we should consider race. Go figure, he was the only black man in the room when he said that and met some resistance. But he basically, from him and some other people, we get what becomes now like cultural studies, right, proper. And one of the arguments that he makes is that, especially when you're in a diaspora, because diasporas are characterized by separation from a homeland and thus some degree of cultural knowledge that's lost, that you get this situation where the country that you're in will sell you your own identity, right? So for example, if you're Latino and you are from, say, Mexico or Nicaragua or, Honduras or anywhere else, if you grow up in that environment, you are probably consuming media created by people who are at least a part of that group of people, broadly speaking, right? Obviously, there's like social stratification. There's different, races and ethnicities, and
I mean that gets into the whole thing with novellas and how white the novellas are.
Absolutely. And so, at least though, in those situations, you have people who are Mexican, who are whatever demographic, at least, right? Although, again, they have their own perspectives when it comes to like who's important and who's not.
Yeah.
Hall's perspective point was that when you are a part of a diaspora, as all of us are ostensibly, right, as existing outside of whatever Latin American country we may ancestrally come from, we typically speaking, because we exist in this society, have our identities constructed and then sold to us by people who are not a part of our group. And Extraño is a great example of that, because he is, he's Brazilian, I want to say.
Yeah, I think he's Brazilian. And he was introduced as part of a effort to have a bunch of new young heroes. Mm-hmm. And he was basically the Doctor Strange of the group. So he's literally Extraño.
And Strange, right? And so he's flamboyant. In addition to being queer coded at the time, right?
He tells people to call him anti-Extraño.
Right. Mm-hmm. And also just the visual composition of the character, which also the visual aspect does dovetail with the flamboyance often associated with Latinidad.
Yep.
In a way that feels like it's attempting to be emasculating, right? Although I've never seen a man in a charo suit who felt emasculated by it, right? But I mean, that's the whole thing. While also like he gets AIDS. He catches HIV from the hemoglobin.
Yes,
the hemoglobin,
right?
The whole thing.
And that's a whole. And so they're talking about a minority racialized identity, along with the coding of a minority sexual identity, along with being stigmatized and the ableist perspective with a particular disease, right? And so this is very much, and it was entirely constructed by people who, if the text is evidence, have no point of reference for any of this stuff. So
and that's the thing, is that this was also an attempt, not just of having, because each of the members of the New Guardians were meant to be of different ethnicities and backgrounds, much like the Giant Size X-Men were, where they're all from different countries, But at the same time, this was a time period when you weren't able to have a gay character be a gay character in mainstream comics. Mm-hmm. So they made him as gay coded as humanly possible. Mm-hmm. To make him be the gay character, which I want to give them a little bit of credit for trying.
Sure. Yeah.
But having the gay guy literally call himself Strange, I'm like,
And it's also worth noting that the way in which he contracts HIV, because he was introduced in 1988, and I know that because that's the year I was born. And so he gets scratched by the hemoglobin, right? And
this is the whole thing.
Yeah, and there's some letters to the editor that DC printed from men who were self-identified as gay, who said, like, that's not how this works. You're spreading misinformation, right? I get that you're trying to do something good, but that's not at all how the transfer of HIV operates, and you're doing more harm than good. And so, it like ostensibly was trying to do a good thing. This guy is a hero. if nothing else, right?
And again, they brought him back. You see here, he is the modern iteration of him.
Mhm.
He's still I hate to say the word flamboyant, but like he's gay,
I mean-
but he's not cartoonish.
He's
like
a bit-
he used to
Would
be.
you say tasteful?
No, I just want to say he is what he is.
Yeah.
He is the kind of person he is as he wants to be, but
Yeah.
he's not the cartoonish stereotype that somebody who was not gay imagined him as.
He's not a caricature. At least it doesn't appear that way.
Yeah.
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 So I got to give him credit for that. I got to give
Yeah.
him credit for that attempt.
Definitely. I mean, there's an attempt for inclusion, right? I mean, they tried. It feels like, hey, we're only going to get one shot at this. Let's throw everything we can imagine.
And of course,
Every buzzword, every
was-
fear.
that was
Crazy.
famously the same comic book that introduced DC's cocaine-powered villain.
Nice.
The 80s were a wild time.
Yeah. The 80s were a hell of a drug.
Cocaine's a hell of a drug.
Well, yeah, it reminds me of I remember two authors that come to mind, and one of them is, I'm blanking right now, although he's one of my favorites, but he wrote Bitter Root. David
Yeah.
Walker.
Okay. I know I did that earlier with Christopher Priest as one of my favorite writers, and I couldn't remember his name.
So actually, and Christopher Priest is the other person I'm thinking of. So David Walker, who wrote Luke Cage, who did a short run series on him, which I really enjoy. Talked about how when he was a kid, he saw the early run of Heroes for Hire, and he was like, "Oh, cool, a black superhero. Why does he talk that way?" Right? And so there's that question of like, this does not appear to be a genuine construction of a Black American character, but it still was like, because you have Luke Cage in that way, you still have David Walker writing Luke Cage 40 years later, right? In the 2000s. And then Chris Priest, I remember reading his remarks on Tony Isabella's Black Lightning, right? And he was saying like, yeah, like Tony was trying, right? And it was imperfect, and it was a bit Earth, Wind, and Fire, certainly. But at the end of the day, like, yeah, it was a foothold.
Tony Isabella, is kind of like, I was about to say kind of like Chris Claremont, but I don't know if that's an insult or a compliment. But both of these creators tried really hard to increase representation for groups that they were not part of, but who also were not in the writer's room.
Yeah.
And so Tony Isabella has created a lot of Black characters for Marvel and DC in the 70s when there were not a lot of Black writers. So he was trying really hard.
And he stopped the Brown Bomber from being a thing.
Oh yeah,
And
that's a thing.
that's worth commendation.
Which
if nothing
which was it, McDuffie or Priest who brought the Brown Bomber back?
McDuffie. Yeah.
But back to point out how horrible it was.
Yeah, for anyone who's not familiar, the Brown Bomber was a character who was a racist Vietnam veteran.
So the background is this.
Yeah.
Marvel had Black Panther and Storm and Luke Cage now, and the DC creators were like, hey, why don't we have Black characters? And for example, Legion of Superheroes, that's in the future, and there were no Black people. So the artists and the writers wanted to put in some Black heroes, and the editor wouldn't let them. And when they would ask why, he'd say, oh, there's a good reason. And so finally, the editor came to them and said, okay, here's your Black hero. And he gave them Tyrock, saying every Black person on Earth went to another planet because they were tired of racism. And so Tyrock is from the planet of Black Earthlings. And the writer and the artist did do the comic, but even afterwards they're like, I felt dirty having done that comic.
Right.
And then there was another character in Legion who was a Pharaoh lad, wore a mask all the time. Well, the writer wanted to have him take off the mask and find out, oh, he's a Black guy. And the editor put a kibosh on that too and said, we don't do that. So finally the writer said, oh, well, he's burned under the helmet and he can't take it off. And then later on, as they wanted to do some Black character, I don't know if it's that same editor or not, but an editor said, well, what if you have a character who's a white guy that when he says a magic word, he becomes a Black guy? And Tony Isabella in the room at the time was like, no, and came up with Black Lightning instead. So that happened. But Dwayne McDuffie learned about that later and introduced Brown Bomber as the racist character that he obviously was.
Mhm.
Because I don't think the original guy that suggested it thought it was a racist idea. He thought it was a great idea. Like, what if Lois Lane became Black for a day? Wouldn't that be great?
Well, as I understand it, the two different racial identities also had different consciousnesses, right? So,
well, like I said, the original version never got past the suggestion.
no, yeah, but yeah,
But in the Dwayne McDuffie one, when he turns Black, he says, "Now I can say," and they're like, "No, you better not."
yeah,
Better not. But things are moving here at the end, guys. We want to talk about we are making changes, and Kevin himself is part of a. I mean, we all are, right? We're all trying to make this message of inclusion, representation, the right way, And one thing we've been working on, I know Kevin, you can definitely talk a little more about it, but is your work with Chispa Comics,
Yeah.
which is with Hector Rodriguez, which does El Peso Hero, David Bowles, and Frederick Aldama had written book, Henry Barajas, Verónica Medrano,
And
Kevin
Terry Blas, who we
Garcia,
named dropped earlier.
Terry
is gonna work on
Blas,
it, yeah.
as well.
The whole
We're
point of
getting
Chispa
everybody
Comics,
linked up to do that.
yeah, Gabriel, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but the whole point of Chispa Comics is it's meant to be a Latino, Latina, Latine run imprint where all the characters are, showing, Latinos, Latinas from a different perspectives, and all the creators, everybody behind the scenes is also of Latine, background. And the big push we're doing right now is one called the 13, and it is each of these characters are teenagers who have powers that are vaguely inspired by Mesoamerican mythology, but the end result is different depending on each character. So some of them are on the nose, very much inspired by mythology. Others are just like, there's something there. We'll get to it later.
Okay. And that's not the same thing as your Golden Age Heroes project.
No. That's something.
No.
Here's the thing. I wrote the Chispa book over a year ago, and it got delayed. Oh, it didn't get delayed, rather, but they rescheduled how it was planned. So now it's not supposed to come out till later this year, hopefully. And then I also wrote another book about teenage luchadors fighting Mexican folklore creatures. It's a children's novel book with pictures in it. And they told me that one might publish in April. We're now in April, and I've yet to hear anything. So soon. So in the meantime, I was like, screw this. I'm going to do my own story, self-published. So I did a Kickstarter for World's War Comics, which is a re-examination of history. Now, that one, representation was important for me, but I was also very particular on how representation showed up for each character. So I actually don't have any Latino characters in that book. Sure. But I do have characters that are of African descent, Egyptian character. I have, there's going to be LGBT characters in there because the idea was stuff that would not have gotten shown in the 40s, but it was still there. They just didn't talk about it.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, Chispa is all about inclusion and representation, and I'm excited how we have these books out now. And then I'm working on something with the Central American team. We also be from El Salvador, so I'll be writing a book from that perspective. So I love how much care Hector and David have really taken into choosing the writers and really being the fact that, because I even called them out on the show, like, hey man, you have these Mexican heroes, but there's more Latinos besides Mexico. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I love that.
And this is what I like about David and Hector, because David's got a long experience as an academic, but also as a writer. And then Hector's got a lot of experience as a teacher like myself, but also in indie comics. So it's been a lot of fun.
Been a lot of fun. Gabriel, I want to just give you a moment here, man. First of all, thank you for coming on the show. I know I've kept you up a little later than maybe expected, but
it's quite all right.
I had a blast, man. I love just picking your brain, having these conversations. I really want to invite you to come back any time. Please feel free.
If you want, we can plan out a 4-hour deep drive.
Hey, man, we can do it. We can get Aldama on here and go nuts.
Listen, in the summer when I ain't got to be up and grading in the next day. No,
I want to give you
a lot of fun.
Yeah, I want to give you a moment, just kind of tell people where they can find you, your socials, and kind of just what maybe if something you can share that people can go find and really just kind of support you and what you're doing as well.
Yeah. So if you hear some clicking in the background, it's because I'm desperately trying to find a document that I should plug because I'm a professional and that's the thing that professionals do.
We are all professionals here, wink.
Yeah.
We're all adults.
We're all adults.
Adults too?
But not at the same time. I can do one or
the other. Yes,
I cannot do both. No, so I am. I'm working on a book on Latinidad and mass media and identity. So it's been a whole thing, and I can't find the stupid title for the book. But essentially, it's looking at how mass media operates to represent Latinidad in a way that we then use for identity construction. So, like, I have a chapter on the news, one on film and TV. I'm currently writing the one on superheroes in particular, and then video games. And then it's a brief kind of thing, but it's a good way to kind of get a taste for how this stuff operates, right? It's kind of a primer, if you will. And God willing, in the Creek Don't Rise, I'll have that done in June, and it'll be out at some point in the future. And I would encourage everyone to pirate it shamelessly. So the other thing, unless my publisher is listening, in which
you're gonna call it "Steal This Book."
Steal This Book. Right. Like, what was that System of a Down album?
Yeah, Steal This album.
Yeah,
oh no, it was a book in the '60s, I think, called "Steal This Book," and that was the idea that he was an activist that wanted people to take it.
Yeah. So
System did a record too.
They did, yeah. So it's probably a reference to that book. So I do that.
Abby Hoffman, had to look it up. Abby Hoffman, 1970.
I'm on TikTok, Instagram, and X or Twitter. It's Twitter at GA_Cruz_PhD. I have a podcast called Office Hours with Dr. C. We're currently in a hiatus at the moment. We are my co-author, my co-producer, my co-host and producer, Barry Thornburg. We are we've moved to a seasonal way of doing it because 3 years of chasing the weekly deadline was making it a little tough.
Hard, man.
So we are designing. Yeah, it is tough. We are designing a new season based around the theme of death and that kind of thing. So, and how that shows up in our pop fiction and what have you. So
I listened to the episodes you did with Dan McClellan. Is that his name?
Oh yeah.
Those are really good episodes. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah,
and they were about death too, actually. Death of Superman.
Yeah, the Death of Superman, right? Which is where I got introduced to Superman comics. Was actually the Reign of the Supermen. Yeah, he's a hoot. I would like to have him back on the show for that, as well as some other people from the podcast. But yeah, so that's what I do. I write and I teach, and I've got some superhero stuff out and about. That if you look up Gabriel Cruz and superheroes, you'll find a couple things. I think the last superhero themed thing that I did was actually published maybe 2 years ago on the Punisher and masculinity. Since then, I've done some other stuff related to like Disney properties and what have you. But yeah.
And to be clear to all the 14-year-olds out there, yes, he actually does teach college classes.
Oh yeah.
On media studies. That means movies, comic books, all that stuff.
Oh yeah. I teach a class on mass media and society, which is what it sounds like. I teach another class on diversity and media, and my favorite class is American pop culture because we get to be weird in there. So anyway. Yeah, so that's what I do. Remember, kids, if your parents ever tell you reading comic books and playing video games won't get you a job, I'm empirical proof that they're wrong, and don't listen to your parents.
Right. Hey, I got paid by Disney to read comic books, so there you go.
Yeah. Every year, I think this is the year I'm going to get my department to cover my Marvel Unlimited subscription. Maybe.
Just sneak it into the budget proposal, just sneak it in there.
It's not that
under
much.
pencils.
What is so funny? When I worked for Marvel, I had a free subscription to Marvel Unlimited, but to get the free one to work, they had to mess with the system. So they had me listed as member since 1961, which I was like, cool, Yeah. So I've been a member of Marvel Unlimited since 1961, but then there was an error in the program, and then when I tried to contact IT, they thought I'd hacked it, so they canceled my account, and I had to get the editors to go in and tell them to reactivate me.
Oh no. All those points gone.
Kevin Garcia, the hacker.
Oh man, I'm not.
Anyway,
that smart.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to, I try to check my email regularly. It's gacruzphd@gmail.com. I get questions from time to time, and I'm usually happy to respond to them as long as you're not threatening to burn down my house, which so far has only happened a couple times on Instagram. So,
what if they invite you to help them burn down somebody else's house?
It depends.
Depends who we're burning down.
Right? I mean, legally, no, of course not.
Yes,
but
no, there's not any house that we would want to know. Of course,
no,
nobody's house. Nobody's house. No house.
Nobody.
No different color houses. White or whatever.
Yeah, it's like certainly not Jeff Bezos's.
Yeah, and no locations in Florida. Anyway, this has gotten dark. So
yes.
I am also found on TikTok at Kevin Garcia _com. And I am also on Instagram the same way. I'm now on Threads there, but I don't use it often enough. But I am on Threads, Kevin Garcia _com. I hated Twitter for the longest time, and now I feel like I don't have to use it anymore. So I don't even acknowledge the fact that I had an account.
You did it.
I mean, yeah,
you did it.
So I don't even worry about it. But on TikTok, I have now reached 10K. I'm now past. I'm not 11K.
Finally.
So
Finally,
I'm
Kevin
so
Garcia
excited
hit the
about that, 'cause
10K.
I've been trying for a while, and Freddie, you've been calling out the Primos every episode saying help him get to 10K.
We did it, Primos. We
Yeah.
made it happen for Mr. Kevin Garcia.
Mhm.
Sure, give yourselves a pat in the back, Primos. But of course, guys, you guys can follow the show at My Primos Podcast on all social media. Of course, our website, myprimospodcast.com. Check out our reviews, our shows, and just whatever shenanigans we get into. And I want to just, of course, thank you, Gabriel, for coming on the show. Please feel free to come on, man. We'll make it happen. We can
Yeah,
get
man.
you, David Bowles, Aldama, and Kevin Garcia to go nuts about comics and everything. I think you'd love it. But of course, Primos, remember, well, it'd be fun. You could debate. Or hey, Gabriel, maybe you can coax your friend to come take on Kevin Garcia.
Listen,
Aquaman versus Namor.
look, I'll get my boss on. I'll get Anthony Ramirez on, who I think wrote I think his dissertation might have been on Blue Beetle. Actually, now that I think about it. But yeah, so I found the name of that book is Latinidad, Identity Formation, and the Mass Media Landscape: Constructing Pocho Villa. So anyway,
Ocho Villa.
Ocho Villa. I like
Yeah.
that.
Nice.
Yeah,
I like
yeah.
that. I like that. But we gotta have you back on, man, when we get to read the book and go out there,
Right.
go steal this book. But
Yes.
Primos, remember, we're wrapping up the show here. Just know you catch us here week to week whenever we can do it. We're chasing that week to week cycle as well. But of course, as always, Primos, no matter where you're from, we're all Primos. Take care.
We out.
Yeah.